At that time, the city had not yet become accustomed to this type of violence, as it perhaps is today. The news was alarming for the neighborhood residents. They even moved the catechism classes we attended to an earlier time. I, however, spent a few days in apparent tranquility, until one afternoon, when my mom came in with clothes that had just dried, and told my brother that his cat was on the neighbor's roof. Carlos ran out, and I followed him. But by the time we got out, we could only see the silhouette moving away at full speed. That night, the dogs wouldn't stop barking on our street. I peeked out from our room's window, and occasionally I thought I saw silhouettes of people walking on the roofs near ours. I couldn't sleep all night. Although I couldn't see the nuns, I knew they were there. I could feel them. And that made it even more terrifying. But I wasn't the only one they frightened. I don't know how many people, especially children, suffered from the same thing in those times. It was well known in those days what happened to a girl from the same elementary school I attended. But in the afternoon shift, it happened to her as she was leaving, when it was almost dark. At the far end of the school, on the edge that led to a ravine, there was an area of completely white soil where some children used to play. This girl had forgotten something there, and when leaving class, instead of going straight to the exit, she ran to that distant corner of the school. That corner also bordered a kindergarten that was completely deserted at that hour. It said that the girl saw someone walking between the kindergarten classrooms. She approached the fence dividing both schools to get a better look, and then she could recognize the figure. It was a nun. The girl wasn't scared because she thought it was a real nun, who for some reason was doing some work in the kindergarten at that hour. So she even obeyed when the woman called her. Immediately after, the girl's screams caught the attention of students and teachers who saw how, in the distance, she was being pulled towards the kindergarten. Several of them crossed over, jumped the fence to reach her, and when they found her, she was crying. She insisted that the horrible woman had tried to bite her, and that upon hearing people approaching, she ran towards the ravine to jump over that high wall in a single leap. No teacher wanted to corroborate that story. A janitor did tell it, but it was an open secret that passed on to us from the afternoon children. Something happened. It was all I managed to know. Something occurred in the church that they didn't tell us about, but they postponed our ceremony for 2 weeks. Oscar was told by his brother, who in turn had heard from Erica, the catechist, that someone had entered to vandalize the place. I could never verify it, but it's true that the next time we entered the church, several repairs were noticeable. The following year, another child disappeared in the neighborhood during those same days of the year. The rumor of a group of child snatchers, as they were called, who were looking for careless children to kidnap and sell their organs, had spread. But some of us still thought that maybe those nuns had something to do with it. When I dared to talk about them with my mother, I realized that she and her friends had already encountered them sometime, many years ago, that they had been roaming the streets at night for a long time, and that they just took them as crazy women, that there was even someone who said they were nuns, expelled from their convent for dark practices. The truth is that no one knew where they came from, or where they took refuge. My mother's friend, the lady I told you was like a grandmother to me, passed away the afternoon before the new date of my first communion. My mother spent that entire day at her house, receiving the lady's relatives, who had traveled from afar to say goodbye. She took Mari Carmen with her and I stayed with Carlos. Something that went beyond the pain of the lady's death was overwhelming me. It made me feel sad and empty inside. Carlos felt the same way. Suddenly Freddy, one of Carlos's friends, came shouting to the house asking us to accompany him. "They found the nun's house," he shouted. It's a cave made in the backyard of an abandoned house near the church. For a moment, we didn't believe him, but he continued with the story. very sure of what he was saying.
They saw them enter with a crying child, and the neighbors came out. They locked themselves in the cave, and I'm coming from there.
Without thinking, Carlos put on his jacket and took the bicycle. He ordered me to stay, but I didn't dare. 5 minutes after they had left, I also ran out on my scooter to head to the church and see if I could find the commotion or the discovery and follow the noise. About 15 minutes later, I arrived completely exhausted at the church, but there was no one around. Nothing could be heard. I advanced down the street towards an area of the neighborhood where I had never been, and the night was completely quiet. Peaceful and quiet. I reached a place, a house that looked very much like the description Freddie had given just a while ago. But there was no one there. The neighboring houses seemed to be deserted. The lights remained off despite it being barely 10 at night. I moved away fearfully, until the horrible screech of a cat came from the yard of the house I had reached. I hurried to get to the church, and I can swear that the figure of a nun was then watching me from the church roof, hidden behind the tower. My hands began to tremble, and I could barely handle my scooter from so much fear I felt at that moment. I passed by the school and could see with total clarity how the same nun I had seen weeks before was watching me from the same classroom, from the same window. This time Carlos didn't even know that I had run out after him. My mother was busy at her friend's house. This time there was no gypsy boy, nor Oscar's brother to help me get home safely. And in the middle of the street, about 50 meters away, the figure of a third nun was waiting for me. I turned around and ran towards the school and ran towards the main street. I had lost the scooter at some point, and I just ran as fast as my legs would allow me. Among the darkness that seemed to have taken over everything in the neighborhood, I found the door wide open, and without thinking, I entered that house to ask for help. I entered screaming that I was alone, that they helped me please, that they wanted to rob me. And a man appeared in the living room surprised. He asked me to tell him what had happened. A man of dirty appearance, bald, shirtless, who could barely be heard speaking because he did it so quietly, in a very strange way. I begged him to please accompany me home, to help me get to my mom to look for my brother. However, without flinching, he put on thick glasses, and, after taking a look at the street, he locked the door behind me. No, it's not advisable to go out now. After he told me that, I replied that I would leave, but he repeated to me in a very angry tone that he wouldn't allow me to do so, that it was dangerous for me to go out there. He then headed to a room, and he told me to go to the kitchen to look for something to eat. At that moment, I felt a tremendous dizziness. I couldn't believe that on top of everything that had happened to me, I had fallen into the clutches of a madman. I didn't know what the hell would happen, but I wasn't planning to stay there, and I knew that I would have to take my chances with whatever was waiting for me outside. The door was locked, and as I could, I opened one of the windows while the guy shouted behind me and tried to stop me. I managed to run out to the street and heard a laugh behind me. When I turned around, the guy was laughing from his door, and above him, the figure of the cat seemed to be watching me too, amused. I don't know how to explain it, but from the movements the animal was making, and maybe it was a hallucination of mine, it seemed that the two of them were laughing at the same time, making the same sound. I arrived running home and Carlos was hanging up the phone. I couldn't find out who he was talking to, and he looked completely pale, as if he had seen a ghost. I asked him what had happened, but he ignored me. He put a few things in his school backpack and asked me to keep quiet. He didn't ask me where I had been, and he didn't let me tell him what had just happened to me. "I have to go," he said and touched my head before opening the door and leaving. I looked out the window and saw a car pass by. It looked a bit like his father's car, but I'm not sure it was, nor that he got in there. It was the last time I saw my brother. I didn't make my first communion the next day, nor did I ever do it afterward. My mother spent the following weeks looking for Carlos everywhere, but all trace of him and his dad was lost. Carlos's dad always got along very well with my mom after their separation, so it was very strange to think that if he had wanted to steal my brother, or that they had decided to leave without notifying my mom, she was never the same again. The news that they had found the nun's lair became known to everyone, and it was the place I had reached that day. However, when I went, I didn't see anything. None of the movement that the others had claimed happened had occurred. The screams, the neighbors destroying the place, taking out satanic articles or something like that, which they found in the house and in the cave behind it. Shortly after, I also noticed that the house of that man I had entered seemed to have been completely abandoned for a long time. As my grades dropped, they sent me to therapy, but there, they only tried to make me believe that everything was a way for my brain to deal with my brother's disappearance. And maybe I came to convince myself for a time that it was so. Until years later, I ran into Oscar again, and he remembered that episode with his brother, and how everyone in the classroom knew about the nuns at my house door, and how close we were to the death of the dwarf man. I then understood how weird everyone was with me for the rest of the year, and why my friends stopped hanging out with me, going to my house, or allowing me to go to theirs. I was changed to a private school shortly after, where I started to be seen as normal again. We no longer live in that neighborhood, but the house is still ours. We've been going since then every month to collect the rent, and on one of those occasions, I casually heard a couple of kids, about 7 or 8 years old, passing by talking about the fear that the black nuns provoked in them. Although I was already an adult, I felt a deep fear and quickly got into the car. And then to my right on the fence of my house, out of the corner of my eye, I saw how the figure of a cat stood on the fence to see me up close. I didn't turn to look at it. I didn't want to. And I'm sure, or rather, I want to be sure that it's a normal cat. The cat of the family that was renting the house. Maybe. But I didn't dare to turn around because of the fear, because of the panic that the memory of that infernal cat provoked in me. I couldn't continue living with moderate tranquility if I had turned to see it again. If it had been him. Excuse me for sending you another message, but I forgot to tell you something important. Sometime after what I'm telling you happened, when I almost had my first communion, when they were building the boulevard that now surrounds the neighborhood, the body of a child was discovered buried just a meter deep in the path. It couldn't be identified, and no one claimed it, as if it had no family, as if it had been a gypsy. Community of Tales of the Night, we bring you a special surprise this evening after sharing the second chapter of Primera Comunión. Something unexpected happened. Several people, touched by what they heard, decided to step forward and share their own experiences. These extra stories are the testimony of brave individuals who dared to raise their voices, inspired by what they heard. Their stories uniquely complement our original tale, adding new layers to the inexplicable. Get ready to hear these additional narrations, each with its own nuance of mystery. I invite you to keep an open mind as we delve into these extra stories. Remember, each shared experience brings us a little closer to understanding the unknown, so get comfortable, turn off the lights if you wish, and join me in exploring these new tales. Who knows, maybe by the end of the night, more people from that neighborhood will be encouraged to tell their own. Now, without further ado, let's give way to the first brave narrator who dared to tell his story after listening to Primera Comunión. I lived in the neighborhood. In my childhood, I don't remember much, except for some specific moments. We moved from there before I started kindergarten, so I don't remember walking the streets of that place. But recently, a cousin shared with me the episode they made about the story of the First Communion. He's a little older. He even remembered visiting us in that house, in that neighborhood. I was curious when I heard it, and asked my parents if they had any information about it, or if it was true about the appearance of those nuns in the neighborhood. But neither of them knew anything. Neither had ever seen anything or heard about it. We listened to the final chapter, my cousin and I together at a family gathering. We went out and commented a little about it, and one of my uncles overheard us. He asked us what we were referring to, and when we told him, he ended up telling us about his experience. He had seen something similar, but not precisely in that neighborhood, but a few kilometers from there, going up Cerro Colorado, Azteca, I think he said the neighborhood was called. My uncle rented a little house near the last streets before the closure made it impossible to continue building. He had just arrived in Tijuana. It would have been in the 1980s. He became friends with some guys who all lived in a very small room next to him. They were from Oaxaca and always invited him to eat. Evidently, my uncle loved eating with them, and without knowing many people in the city, he started spending every weekend with them. Sometimes they would climb to the top of Cerro Colorado to see the entire city from there. At that time, they were practically on the outskirts of Tijuana. Today, this hill is almost the center of the entire city. One of those times they went up quite late. They stayed up there for a good while until night fell on them. They were then going to try to go down a more dangerous path that would take them much closer to home. Night was about to fall completely. Before carefully descending through an area where they could no longer walk and would have to crawl, one of his neighbors asked him to turn around. In the distance, they saw a group of 7 silhouettes climbing the hill. They were in line and leaning forward. Due to the darkness, they only recognized the silhouette, and they had no idea what or who it was. "They're girls," one of them said, very sure, although without having seen them either. "Let's go see what they're doing." Since they were all very young for some reason, they thought that was a good idea. 3 of them ran back, climbing up again, excited about what they thought was a group of girls, although it wouldn't make much sense for girls alone to have gone there at that hour. Although it wasn't as dangerous as it is today. After a few minutes, they thought they had lost sight of them, but after a while, they could see them thanks to the light of a bonfire, in a clearing. Before reaching the top, they asked each other how they had climbed so fast. They had gotten way ahead. It was impossible, but someone answered that they surely knew a better route. As they approached, they thought of arriving saying they were lost, and if they could stay with them. But as they got closer, they became worried. Some chants began to be heard, and although they didn't recognize those words, that language, something inside them made them know they should be scared. The 7 women seemed to be standing, contemplating a figure, something burning in the center, in the fire. They appeared to be dressed as nuns. My uncle and the other boys had stopped about 100 meters from them, watching, hidden. But suddenly, one of them turned to look at them, and letting out a shriek, started running towards them. The boys began to run, They went down, fell, rolled. They got up. The woman's shriek was getting closer and closer. They ended up going down through a neighborhood that was no longer the one they had gone up through, and where they had never been. They ran towards a light on the first street that could be seen just as they came down the hill. Light was coming from a house, and there were people and children outside. It was one of those little houses where dinner is sometimes sold, and they ran in there, asking for help, scaring all those present. Before they could finish explaining what had happened to them, the shriek was already at the door. The nun, the woman, was screaming threateningly on the sidewalk without entering, and the children who were in the place ran down the street. And others went to the back of the house, crying in fear. The lady of the place, apparently the one who sold the food, started yelling at that demonic thing to leave, and she approached to chase it away, threatening it with a large knife. "Go away, in the name of God," she shouted while this woman just smiled. She was mocking. When the lady approached her, already threatening her very closely with cutting her, the nun started running in leaps towards the hill again. And meanwhile, 2 neighbors who had just arrived were asking others for help to go after her. But they were finally convinced by the lady that it wasn't a good idea, and they returned to their homes. "It's been a long time since they passed by here," said the lady, and then she offered food to my uncle and the 2 boys who were with him. My uncle endured a whole year living there, right next to the hill. The boys from Oaxaca left earlier, although they continued to socialize and spend weekends together. They never went up Cerro Colorado again.